Today, we are going to start with photography, with wildlife photography, nature photography. But from there, we will quickly go into topics of conservation and policy and human wildlife interactions, which is sort of something on the banner of this podcast. Because, of course, this is Conservation and Science Podcast, where we take a deep dive into topics of ecology, conservation, and human wildlife interactions. And I'm Tommy Serafinsky, and I always strive to bring you diverse perspectives on the topics that we cover. And today, it is my great pleasure to guest a long-standing friend of the podcast and a long-time supporter of the podcast who managed huge scientific projects all over the United States, worked in 2 different presidential administrations in Washington, D.C., in the Office of the Environmental Protection Agency, and obviously, above all that, a conservationist and a photographer, Tony Bynum. Tony, welcome to the show.
Thank you. That was a fantastic introduction. I appreciate it.
No, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. We were in contact for a long time, and folks, surely, and those of you who are regular listeners heard me mentioning Tony on more than one occasions, and some of the sage advice that you gave me for the conversations that we're having. And listen, I gave you a little a short introduction. Did I miss something? Do you think that so I would like to hear from you, like you thinking about yourself as a photographer first and foremost. So just like a short introduction for the listeners if I'd missed anything.
No, I think you're on. I would add, if there's anything that I think one of the most important aspects about my past and what brought me here today to this place in this universe is I was lucky enough to be born in a place in this world where I have the opportunities that I've had. And most people can't say that. They're constrained by whatever system they're in. But at least the one that I found myself in, born in 1970, sure, there was struggles. But today, looking back, it's just by nature, the fact that I was born on this continent and the freedom we have in to some extent in America. And so that's a big part of my story. I would not be here if I were living somewhere else and not able to make the choices I've made.
You're in Montana, United States of America. Right. Tony, I want to kick off with the question that you are probably the best suited guest yet to answer that question. And I was asking that question to many people, scientists, and I have a different answers, sometimes surprising. So you're a photographer and you're a hunter. And I remember when I read it first, I read it in a book about trophy hunting, but I don't remember who was the line from. I think the gentleman is named José Ortega y Gasset, who said something, I'm paraphrasing, something that photography can never replace hunting, never be a substitute for hunting, because photography is just observing while hunting is participating. Curious of your views on that. Is that correct? Is that incorrect? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Are there any caveats in this statement?
I would say mostly I agree, but things are changing. And I think it's important to recognize now that I probably wouldn't have been able to answer it this way 15 years ago or 10 years ago, because what I'm about to sort of describe is a matter of changing access to wildlife and technology. And so while it makes sense to say, on one hand, photographers are sort of taking photos and the hunting side is participating, that would be ignoring the fact that there is ample evidence daily on the internet, you can find it, that we are, as photographers, participating. You're changing behavior, you're impacting the environment, you're causing accidents, animals die because of our actions as photographers. This is common, especially in places like national parks, parts of the United States where animals are continuously habituated by humans because there are hundreds, literally, of them participating in wildlife photography in places where they're supposed to be, quote, wild. But these animals are affected by that every single day. And so while there may be some wild components left, and while it might feel wild to people who aren't used to wild, a lot of these places are sort of unwilding in a sense. The animals are becoming habituated. People are sort of crazed by the fact that they get to explore, say, Yellowstone National Park, and we habituate animals that then run across on the highway because they are accustomed to being on roads, and then they get killed. To me, that's pretty close to direct. I mean, I don't know. I have seen it and witnessed these actions of multiple photographers causing automobile accidents, causing animals to be run over on highways. So I mean, on one level, okay, I understand where he's coming from. On another, I think today we have so many people enjoying the fun of looking at wildlife, and that has benefits. I mean, I'm not saying it's terrible, but you have to kind of recalibrate it. What we used to do even 20 years ago, there were five guys out trying to get a picture of a big moose somewhere, and that was it. It wasn't that much of an impact. But today, man, I really changed my habits as a result of observing the impact that photographers can have on wildlife.
That's a very interesting answer, because usually the answer, like, so the participation part mentioned in the original quote was like from the perspective of the person being out there and participating in food chain, getting food from the animal they killed and so on. But you're pointed out that, like, oh, hang on a second, that actually goes both ways. So in a sense, that quote was fairly like a anthropocentric, because you said, like, well, that participation is in a changing, and this is very interesting answer.
Well, I mean, I can comment just
Yeah.
quickly on the more centered perspective. When I started as a photographer, and when I was always a hunter and a fisherman, that's sort of been my lifelong endeavor. The photography and wildlife, as it turned out, was an expression more of an opportunity to learn about wildlife. And if there's anything you're going to do that makes you a better or a better hunter, that's to learn the habits of wildlife. And so, as it turns out, knowing more about the habits of the animals that you are going to pursue or that you want to hunt year round, there's not a better way to become a better hunter. Most people hunt when sort of this is a season, it's in the fall. But when you can hunt them with a camera year round, you understand their habits and what their decision-making sort of process is at a much finer grain. And when you do that, you find that you're more successful hunter. And so I also believe that there's enormous value in that. And I got a lot of value out of that. I mean, it put me in the field at times when you would normally not go wandering around looking for deer, that might be 50 miles from where you're going to hunt them, to understand their habits and why they do what they do. And so the connection between what that animal or what the deer is that you're going to hunt. I mean, you can say that about Ireland and Scotland. Look at those deer, they move around. And so when you're hunting them, it's like, okay, well, they're always on A or B land during the roar. That's where they want to be, because that's where the girls are. But if you want to learn about their habits, you have to go explore them when they're on the B land or the C or some neighbor place. And so to me, that was important. And along the way, you just learn enormous amounts about the ecology and the environment. And so to me, if you're a hunter, those things are important and critical. And it's not enough to just, grab the rifle out of the closet once a year, run out the door, pop a deer, and come home.
Yeah. Listen, when during one of our conversations, we were talking about approach to hunting, which can be either transactional or value based. I'm curious of your comments on, like, what does it mean, transactional or value based approach to hunting?
It's an excellent cross section or line or divergent, whatever it is. It is important to understand, because from the scientific or the ecological side, there are sort of limits to the numbers of animals that can occupy a habitat, and then on the more emotional or philosophical side, you're killing something. And so the act of taking a life is critical to understand that it's not it's you know I think everyone who hunts, in particular the people I've run into in Europe, um, I have learned a deep respect for every person that I've met across the UK and in Europe that hunts. They have deep respect for these animals, and so and that surprised me. I'll admit. I mean, the first time I went, I was thinking, "Oh man, these guys they don't know what they're doing, over here." And I don't know why I thought that, but I just thought, we're the rugged Westerners. We know what we're doing. We're the big mountain men and all that stuff. And I was so impressed with the skills and the techniques and the thoughtfulness that the folks had in Europe and in the UK, and the length to which they go to participate, the things they have to actually do in order to kill animals. I mean, we take it for granted in the United States. We just go, right? There's all kinds of rules and issues and things in Europe that never crossed my mind. And so I think the people who are participating in other parts of the world like that, they're very thoughtful, because they recognize that it's not just a right in a way, it's like a gift or it's a privilege. And they have to follow those rules, and they have to be very, I mean, I think, I don't know if I'm drifting too far off the topic, but I think one of the interesting things that I learned about hunting in most other parts of the world is that they actually have an expert with you a lot of times who understands the ecology. They're there to help make good decisions about not just maybe technique and tactics, but more about which animals should be harvested. And they understand the landscape and they know where they're at, and they have intimate knowledge about those places. Whereas in America, unless you're guided, which most people are just freelance hunters, you just, they grab their gun and go shoot a deer. Um, Very unselective, sort of just, it's my right. So we just go out and shoot whatever we see. And there are rules, don't get me wrong, but we don't necessarily take that sort of level of careful approach. And so from my personal view, I am a hunter that is private. I don't it's just such a weird sort of place to sort of live in. Like, I've been a hunting photographer for 15 years, right? I go around the world and I photograph people hunting. And it's like fascinating to me. And yet you'll never find a picture of me with a dead animal on the internet. Because when I started, the first thing I decided, because I was already a hunter, was this hunting is about me and my satisfaction with the connections I have with the world and with the animals and with my place and myself. And so I don't want to be caught up in this sort of this race to kill. And that's what TV becomes. That's what the internet becomes. That's what Instagram becomes. That's what sort of this proliferation of the killing exercise and the trophy. I'll call it a trophy. It's a trophy is defined by whoever wants to define it, but what it really is here is something that represents my success, whether it's an antler or a head or a body or a big antlers, whatever it is, it's somebody's. But you can't photograph and you can't film success the way I feel about it. And to me, I early just made the separation. Like, I'm going to hunt for me. I'm going to kill animals for me. I'm going to eat animals that I want to eat. And I'm not going to be part of the sort of this, I don't know what to call it. I do know what to call it, but I think just the idea that in order to be seen as a successful hunter, you have to show your prize. I just disagree with that fundamentally. I don't disagree with the activity. I don't disagree with showing people enjoying the activities and the connections. But I think that what we do is just end up with this thing. And here's a weird thing about it. We don't do the same thing with fish. Like, it's okay to have a fish picture for the most part, right? Like, I caught a 25-pound salmon, in the river, and here's my big salmon. But if you were to do that with a deer, some people just lose their mind, and they don't with fish. So anyhow, I think it's deeply personal, and I am not judgmental in terms of why you hunt. I think a dead animal's a dead animal. Clean, sane kill is the same for, that animal, whether it was killed because someone thought it had neat horns or whether someone thought this was the best tasting animal I could ever eat. I mean, to me, I don't really want to be in their head about that. What I'm interested in is the conservation of these species, the habitat in which they live, and the activity in which we can participate in because we have a very smart, well-designed system and structure for managing wildlife.
I totally agree with that. And especially when I think that when you presenting those photos, those call them trophies, what they are, and I don't mean this in a negative way, because they're trophy is, you can have a sporting trophy. It's a good thing. It's funny that actually hunting has this taint on the word trophy, like as if something wrong, right? So I don't think it's bad if you're, you know, within the realm of your colleagues, of your friends, of people who maybe share this experience with you or maybe know you, who you are, and this is where you show, hey, look, I shot this deer, I shot this buck, I caught this salmon. I think when it goes off the rails is when you start publicizing that to the anonymous strangers on the internet, and not only you don't know really who you're showing this to, it is disconnected from everything else that's going on, but also I think that it can easily hijack your own mind, and then that is becoming the sole focus. This is becoming of like, oh, I need to post another picture with a deer or with a fish because someone, they gonna think that I'm not fit or something. And then it totally flips that pyramid of values on its head. It's not sort of like a cherry on the cake. It is becoming the thing I want, and then I'm focusing totally on. So that's my take on this.
I think you're right. I feel like part of it is probably, I mean, this is getting to some philosophical and psychological issues, but I think
that's what we do on this podcast, man.
Well, and I think it's critical. That's why I love what you do. You cross the lines, and I think it's important, especially making hard decisions. And wildlife, they're tough choices to make. Is that people? Well, I think, as I pointed out, hunting is deeply personal for me, and I think each person ought to have whatever reverence they want. I think what happens, as you point out, is people get this internet and they want to start posting more pictures, and it motivates them and drives them, and and I always ask the question, like, what is the point? And I cannot disconnect. So if I'm going to go, I can't disconnect myself from the point. The point for me is we live in a universe, in a place that we have to respect and we have to participate in equally on both sides of the spectrum if we want something for the future generations. And so that means I have to be responsible. And it's not cliche. It's actually important, because the history of mankind is that we have done some things in places where we've had to change our values and our beliefs and our views in order to have a better life for everyone. And so in North America, we've done a pretty decent job with bringing some wildlife populations back that prior generations have totally decimated. And I understand that, and I don't want to see that again. And so anyway, it's just really important, I think, for people to not turn away people who would otherwise support the activity of hunting as a matter of conservation. And that's the problem that we've run into in America, is that we know that largely in America, people support hunting for conservation, for food. Killing deer to eat is supported unanimously across the country. There's 15% of the people who just don't like killing at all. But what we've managed to do in the last 10 years is turn off another 15 or 20% because we're throwing dead animals at them all the time. And they're just like, wait a minute, this doesn't look like what I thought it was. And they don't ask more questions. And I don't think they have to. It's not up to them to say, oh, well, why are you doing that? It's up to us as hunters to be more careful. And that's just my view. I'm in the minority. I got to tell you, there's a lot of folks in this country who just believe the harder we need to push harder. We need to put more deadheads on there. We need to shove it in the face of the radical left, the anti-hunter, and carve out our niche. And to which I say, that has never worked for very long. It's not going to work for very long here either. So you can do that, but there's a limit to that. At some point, the population is you will not overwhelm the population by convincing them it's okay to have dead deer on the internet. It's not going to work.
Totally. I totally agree with that.
And incidentally, I want to keep eating wildlife. I mean, that's the tragic part of this, is that what we're doing is pushing this system towards sort of the brink of creating more hostility and more interrupting more of what most people support. It's kind of insane, actually.
And you know what? This is and you listener also know that this is what is happening often, that we just go into direction we didn't anticipate it going. But I think, like I said this thing, that if in, I don't know, 20, 30, 50 years of time, hunting is, let's say, not going to be accessible for recreational hunters, I don't blame, the greenies, the lefties, the bunny huggers. No, that I blame hunting organizations, because I think that hunting organizations in the United States as well, some of them at least, as well as in Europe, doing absolutely terrible job. And their job is to preserve hunting for future generations. This is their job. And then when I talk with the high-ranking hunting organization representatives in one of the bigger countries in Europe, and they go like, no, we need to laugh at them and, like you say, push harder. I was like, oh my God, man. It is like exactly the opposite. And if the hunting will be done, that is your fault, and people with the mindset like yourself. Especially that the demographics is...
That's exactly where I was headed. That is exactly
right. You
point.
Go to this hunting organization, it is hard to find someone below 40. Hell, this is hard to find someone below 50.
What they're doing is they're mistaking their own fraternity for what would be called sort of maybe not a fraternity of young people. These younger folks don't have that fraternity. They weren't raised, in a duck blind. And so these assumptions are that everybody's has the same background and the same knowledge, and that's just not true.
That's not true. Tony, maybe that is a good moment to change the tack a little bit and talk about your indigenous perspectives. So you can tell us, because I'm surely gonna butcher that. You're a member of a tribe. You're a member of a native population, First Nation. So even for people in Europe, how to talk about what is the terminology, what is the lingo, would be already helpful. But I think that you have, or maybe that's a question, to what extent that ancestry gives you unique perspective or different perspectives on hunting and on the environment and on the conservation.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think I think the history of every individual should have some effect on who they are and where they're going in life. And so, just as anyone's from a place, I don't think because my mother was Native and my grandmother, that necessarily gives me any more right or less right per se to have a view. I don't look at it that way. I look at it like, I have this knowledge now, and I have this experience, and I have these relationships, and I sort of, because of how I've been raised, I think I have a responsibility to respect that and sort of be careful about it and to move forward with it, as both from an Anglo-European Western thinking to Native, Indigenous, American Indian, Native American, First Nations, Indigenous people, that whole sort of idea and concept and reality. And so the difficulty is in melding the two together and trying to tell a story about it. I mean, that's the complex part. It's because in many ways, the sort of Western European thinking is in almost opposition to some of the teachings and some of the knowledge of Native people. And in fact, the idea that sort of you show up and you exploit everything, I'm not saying people didn't exploit resources across the globe for generations and thousands of years. I'm just saying that the way in which it was done and the way in which you learned and understood. So the connection between sort of the indigenous Native American side and how that influences maybe my perspective on things is I think it's very much like people who understand their past. And I think it's important that we understand our past because then we sort of move forward in life and hopefully make better decisions because we understand where we're from. And that has created opportunities in my thinking that are important, but it's also conflicting in some ways because the two sides can be opposing one another. And even in on the cultural sense, where I just have a sort of different way of approaching people and operating and listening and participating, and sometimes that's to my disadvantage. Other times, I mean, I think one way to describe it would be like the French in a way. And I'm picking on the French because I'm just impressed with some of the French people I've been around in that they just do stuff that they do, right? And that's a good thing, right? And the energy that some of these French guys I've had, it's just it's extraordinary. They're passionate and they do things that, and they say things and they're just going and sometimes you just don't have any way of being a part of that because there's no sort of open space or time. So anyhow, it's a matter of conservation, land ethics. I think everybody can have that. I just feel like having experienced. Let me say this: your mind is extremely powerful, more powerful than any physical aspect that you have. I mean, it is until you experience it. If you believe, I'll give you an example. If you believe in the stories about a raven or a crow, you may not have the story, but you may end up having an experience, right? And when you have the story and then the experience or vice versa, your world changes because now it has meaning, right? So you can be laying out there in the prairie or under the stars or in the mountains and have this experience, say, with a raven or a coyote or a specific species. And if you don't have a story to connect that, you sort of think it's cool. It's like, oh, wow, but then you go like, I don't know what it meant. I don't really know if it meant anything. And most people just think I was just lucky. It was just happenstance. I was just in the right place at the right time. Whereas if you have the stories from your own past, from people who are land-based, and they will have stories about that And so when you connect those two things, your mind becomes a lot broader, sort of open to what can you actually accomplish in life? What can you actually do in the world? What kind of what's your happiness like? It affects everything. And so I often tell a story about my uncle, my great uncle. I was probably 4 or 5 years old, and he's a native guy, um, and my parents were, particularly my other mother, was sort of their Indian hippie gal. Like, I don't know if you can disconnect the two. In 1975, in America, with the music and all this, right? And and my uncle, there was a guitar in the room where I was at, and my mom had the guitar because she kind of liked to play it. And he came in and he turned the guitar over and used it as a drum. And the reason I think that's important is because this is how we should, I hope, be teaching our young people, teaching people to think about things. Like, you saw a guitar and strings, and if the only time you've ever seen that is somebody strumming it, maybe that's what you think it's for. And it is for some people. But some people see this opportunity to make different music with the same tool. And to me, that is really, really the essence of this. Like it kind of boils down to having those experiences and those stories where I talked about the crow or the raven. Like as a child, I had these experiences that to this day stand as pivot points in my life about how we look at the environment. And without the story connected to that experience, I'm not sure it would be that effective. But I have the stories of the coyote and the stories of the ravens and the stories of the salmon and the stories of the elk and the bears to match with the landscape and with the environment. And so how does it affect? I mean, I think those stories are critical, and we've lost a lot of that, at least in the North America. I can't speak to what Europeans do or how they understand this stuff. I just have no idea. I don't know what their connections are like. I assume because I've hunted with some, there's long tradition, but I have never heard anyone tell me a story about how this island became to be an island out in the ocean off the coast of Ireland other than they I'm a geographer by training. I was, like I went to college, I became a geographer, and then I got a master's degree in science. So I get that. But there's no story. It's sort of like this is what Strahler says happened when these just tectonic shift occurred. Like, okay, that's cool, and then maybe that's what happened, but there's no story. So I don't know if that helps, but that's my
It does. No, it does, and I think this is critical. This connection, and I know a filmmaker and a writer. His name is Bertie Brosnan Jr. Because Bertie Brosnan Sr. was a guest on the podcast, and he does a lot of these stories, specifically focusing on Ireland. Exactly what you're saying. That there is like a deeper story that complements the like a hard evidence, like a hard historical or geographical evidence. Tony, you are famous for saying, "Don't just love something, do something for it." And I love it because it's easy to say, "Oh, I love like something," and then that's where it ends, right? So I am curious, how do you maybe not only understand that, but how do you understand that from the perspective of photography, and how you understand the role of photography and the role of what you're doing in the conservation and perhaps in telling those stories as well.
Well, I mean, there's a long tradition. Here we go with tradition around the world of art changing behavior and of visual components helping to explain, this sort of verbal story, this exchange that we have between one another and talking about stories, but this visual component. And wherever you go, if you study a little bit about like sort of in North America, how did we get Yellowstone Park? How did we get Yosemite National Park? How did we get these, fantastic places that people visit from all over the world? Turns out that a lot of that history about the current ownership of that land or how we manage it relates to art. It relates to visual, it relates to paintings, it relates to photographs, it relates to, something that people can visually connect with. And having sort of the experiences I've had in my own life with policy, federal government, tribal government, like the bureaucracy, the science, the hunting, the field work, um, I think it's sort of an organic end in a way. It's sort of like people do make decisions based on all kinds of information, and the effect that visuals have on people's decision making is immense. Not more understood than today, I think. Like we just talked about, impressions, photographs change people's behavior. It changes their beliefs. Photographs are powerful. And I think people just think they're pictures, sometimes like, oh, we're just taking pictures. Like, well, you are, but what you put out to the world matters. And so I've always felt that, you know, that I have a responsibility back to that sort of theme again, which is Um, I have to do something because I'm exploiting the world around me with a camera, with my presence sometimes. I'm part of it. I mean, I'm a part of this world and I have to take from it and it has to give. Otherwise, there's no relationship. We cease to exist. Give and take. And so I I look at these visuals and I say, like, what am I leaving behind for people to remember about whatever the story is at the time? And that is important to me, especially with my personal projects, because I want to leave an impression that, the world is not about just about like nature. The world is about the connections between humans and nature because we have to live together. And so that's where I try to operate, but I try to be respectful as well. And so doing something for it means, as I've traveled around observing people hunting and fishing around the world, um, and also the connection between the North American system of wildlife management. I mean, you can't go without saying that that model is important in this discussion to some extent. My sort of my historical background from sort of the native perspective is much different. That expectation is that wildlife are there because they are there for us and they give to us. And we take them because they're giving themselves to us. But then you take the Western view of that, it's like, oh, well, that must mean we just take, and it's all gone before we know it. Right. So there's a balance back and forth. And the North American sort of model of paying for things, right? This is important because in order to manage wildlife, you have to have resources to do that. And in North America, we have wildlife agencies, we have people who are paid professionals to help us manage wildlife. And so, I mean, that's all part of this sort of story about how we end up with wildlife and how we end up with the programs and plans that we use to kill animals, to take animals, and then the art part of it. And for me, the giving back can't just be, and maybe it could be. I shouldn't say that. It can be for some people. I'm going to go hunting. I'm going to take. I'm going to go hiking. I'm going to take. I'm going to go, explore this environment and not return anything. And in some cases, they're paying their dues and they feel like they can take because they send money to a conservation organization, right? And or they support hunting wild sheep by spending $1 million on a tag to go kill one. Or they go to Africa and they harvest animals and they kill animals, which help support the local economy in ways that are important. And so, there's all these different sort of levels of interaction, but my experience in observing it around the world is we never do enough in return. Some people do a lot. Some people give out millions and millions of dollars. And I don't know that if that's the right judgment. I don't know if that's the right measure, but it's certainly a lot better than the people who just show up and take something and then leave. I think we owe the system. It's like a checking account. You can have money in your checking account, but you keep writing checks without putting money in that bank account, and pretty soon you're out of money. In the same way that if we just keep killing and killing and killing and not recognizing that we have to put it back. And so again, it's very difficult for me um to describe what it means to give back, because on one hand, I feel like if I'm going to go deer hunt, there are situations where those deer or elk or animals are presenting themselves because it's time for them to die and be part of my nourishment. And yet other times you're going, well, okay, I'm not supposed to shoot that one because it's not big enough. Or maybe that one's not the right one to kill, but that's based on some scientific model, right? Or some preconceived notion or the internet. Maybe that's what you're doing. You're hunting for the internet. So all of this sort of stuff is creating enormous complexity in how we manage wildlife. It compounding the difficulty. And then, our systems aren't changing fast enough to incorporate all that new information. We keep using the same sort of thinking. And I'm not being super critical of that. It's just we have to be very aware that the world is changing so rapidly that our systems have to sort of keep up with that because it's swamping us in some cases. Things are changing so rapidly that we have a hard time with administration and government and management, keeping pace with that. And so anyway, I'm very worried about this stuff, but I think these things are things I spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think in order to move forward with good, solid, respectful, sustainable, giving back systems, people who participate have to know something more than where to buy the hunting license. That's not enough.
Tony, you hit on so many points, not only that we discussed on the podcast, but also that I was thinking about them. So one, I just want to briefly acknowledge. I like your thing, like, oh, the animal presents itself and allows, and I was reading book about wolves and interaction between wolves and ungulates, between your elk, your deer, your and that book was written by the scientists, by biologists, and the takeaway was like that we don't really know why in certain situations the wolves will take a deer over an elk that is big and healthy, and they go for a kill. And on some occasions, there is an old deer or maybe young deer, and the pack of wolves is there, and it's a short kill, and something is happening, and that scientist said, like, the only way to describe is like it wasn't time for this deer to die, to be killed by a wolf just yet. And it seems like it was like an understanding of the same situation by both wolves and a deer. And I understand that some people that might sound woo woo, but that is this, I guess, this additional element that is sometimes hard to grasp. Like, there is something else going on, and based purely on the maths. Let's say this many wolves and this, it just don't work. So that was one thing that I want to acknowledge what you said. The other one is, I made a few years ago and material, like a short video where oh man, I got the heat for that. But I said something like, a lot of people who claim conservation, they're not conservationists. And hunters, well, they might be, but a lot of hunters are not conservationists. Only because you are in the system that supports conservation and you're paying your license money or whatever, that doesn't make you a conservationist. That make you a contributor to a conservation, right? An example that I gave, like for many years, I was absolutely mad shark fishing. I was going shark fishing. I was out there at the sea every weekend of the season, and was spending exorbitant amounts of money on charter boats. And each shark that was caught was measured, the full length, the fork length, the girth, and it was tagged with a number, and all this data with the tag and number and all these measurements were sent to fishery board. And to this day, we've done a podcast about this program. This is a gold standard program for shark and elasmo branch tagging and research, started in Ireland, the whole shebang. So I was participating in that and spent a lot of money on that. I would never claim shark conservation. I would never call myself shark conservationist. I was just a part of the system that was set up, right? And I guess like a litmus test is like, would you go shark fishing if you were not part of these programs? Yes, I would. I'm not a conservationist. Like, someone else is a conservationist. Someone else sort out that program. Someone else is going to use that data. Someone else going to work on the policy. They are conservationists. I wouldn't claim conservationist. And funnily enough, the most heat I got because I call out bird ringers. It's like, you're not conservationist. You're just ringing you're just going and you're doing this thing, and like no bird ever is better for being ringed. Arguably, it's just not the pleasant experience. And I think that sometimes it's very, very difficult to people to make that connection into like, oh, I love something, I do something, I contributing, like 1, 2, 3 steps removed from conservation, but that conservation might or might not happen, right? To the argument that we were discussing before we start recording, like, the fact that we even gather all that data and have all that data, whether it's birds being ringed or sharks being tagged or whatever else, that in itself is also not a conservation. It's like that someone needs to do something and actually do something, I guess, to your point, to benefit, so those sharks can benefit, so their environment benefits, so the birds benefit. Like doing science on wildlife, it's not conservation in itself, right? So
I think that's a great point. I'll draw a really direct connection for decisions that I make, and one in particular that I made that I consider to be a conservation, do something for it decision, and it relates to grizzly bears. And for a number of years, I did like to take photographs of grizzly bears, and there was a market for that, very small, but it wasn't really about the market for selling grizzly bear photos. To me, it was about the experience, and like it was just finding them because you're rare and they're unique, and like there's all kinds of reasons, right? It After sort of doing this activity for a number of years, I started to think about what is my impact on this? Like, who am I doing this for? What is the point? Like, let's say I make $500 a year selling grizzly photos, maybe 1,000 in a good year. I sold a cover of a magazine and it's a grizzly bear photo and I made $1,000. It cost me $5 to get it. So I'm thinking, is this a business decision or is there something else going on here? What is motivating me to spend $5 to make $1,000? It's obviously a poor business decision. I am enjoying it, so I'm going to get some sort of enjoyment out of that, right? Like, but what I started to understand for myself is there is enough grizzly photos. Like, I'm not even affecting anything other than I'm making some gas money if I can sell a photo. So it's purely based on my own greed or my own interest and there's nothing particularly wrong with that. But here's the point where I broke. I broke when I recognized that I was doing not just nothing for the animal, but I was putting that animal in jeopardy of dying because of my selfish behavior of wanting to get that picture that nobody's going to care about. It's probably never going to get seen. I have to wrestle 12 or 14 or 20 other people, including the traffic and the other photographers, and I have to spend a bunch of money, and I'm driving around, I'm taking airplanes. Like, this is insane. Like, this is not what this is about for me. Had I had a different experience, let's say, 3 of us were photographing, some endangered species, and it actually changed someone's mind because they saw these images, that would be different. But these are grizzly bears. Like, there's plenty of grizzly photos. What the hell am I doing? And so I chose to not do that anymore, right? It was a financial decision in a sense of, well, it was also, maybe it was a prestigious decision. Maybe it was one that said, I will no longer be known as a grizzly bear photographer. And that hurts because it's cool to be a grizzly bear photographer, right? I'm the big buck killer. If I stop killing big bucks, I'm not going to be that guy anymore. So I quit. I also quit taking people to photograph other wildlife. No longer am I photographing young of the year babies. No bighorn sheep babies, no deer babies, no, elk babies. Especially if someone wants me to take them to do that. Access. And so I pulled back on these things going, like, what's the point of this? All I'm doing is jeopardizing the safety of these animals or their purpose. And so I don't see my photography the same way I see my personal hunting, where if a deer comes to me and says, okay, I need to die, I get to eat it, and all this happens. I see that as a conscious decision of like, okay, I need to assess what I'm up to here. Am I doing the right thing by possibly causing this grizzly bear to be more habituated so that it stays next to the road longer, so that cubs get run over or it gets hit by a semi truck and the cubs get abandoned? Am I doing anything for that animal? No, I'm doing just the opposite of it. So that's in a nutshell and this is because of technology, it's because of population increase in some ways, or access to wildlife, access to opportunities to exploit wildlife without, I mean, I'll wrap this up by saying something that I think is really important that doesn't get said enough. I will be, I will be, well, if people hear this and they're wildlife photographers, they may or may not even understand this themselves, because it takes a lot of thought and careful thought to understand this. But when I describe it, you'll get it. The next time you open up a magazine, or you're looking at a hunting publication, or you're looking at wildlife magazines, just study the photos of the wildlife, the expressions of the animals, the way they're behaving, what they look like. You can tell as a photographer, as someone who studies wildlife intimately that way, what's happening. Never more apparent than with bears. Cubs. If you see a cub in a tree and it's a photo, the cub is probably scared to death. Now, I'm not saying every shot is that way, but you can look at these images and see, well, I can tell what's happening there. I know what's going on. The sow is freaked out on a tree next to it somewhere, and its cub is up a tree right now, and there's 12 people there trying to get photos of this poor cub in a tree because it's so cute, and then it ends up on a Hallmark card or the cover of the wildlife magazine. So I've been very conscious to try and focus on situations where I can take wildlife photographs that respect the situation, that aren't jeopardizing the animal, that are in a way representative of what they're doing, because that's what they're doing, not because I've chased them up a tree or because they're freaking out. And so look carefully at wildlife images and see if you can tell what's happening there. And sometimes you can. If you're paying attention, you can really, it's like, oh yeah, well, I can tell, this guy's looking scared, or their eyeballs are a certain way, or so I'm not trying to put myself in any other sort of like I'm better or worse or this. I'm saying I'm taking all this information in and learning about my impact as it relates to your question of do something for it. And so some of these things, like, the best choice I can make in this situation is to extract myself. I did that. That is a hard decision when what you are is a wildlife photographer, to take yourself out of the game so you're no longer the grizzly bear guy. You're nobody. So to me, that's what it's about.
I can only second that, Tony. And when you said it, like this is so. I actually ruined a lot of photos for people who are showing me a photo, and it's like, oh, look at it, this is like a cute, and I look at that photo and it is like blatantly obvious it's not pretty. It's like you said, the animal is in a distress, the situation is not natural, that animal shouldn't be there, or it shouldn't behave this way, or like 10 other things. And people are getting upset sometimes, like, oh, I'm not showing, like, but yeah, like just like if people have a little bit of a thought, and the initial is like upset and pushback, but then after they maybe see the second or third photo, it's like, hey, hang on a minute. So I totally, and folks listening and watching this, totally, this is very important point. Just like you said, study it. Just not just like, oh, cute, move on, the next one. Like, what is really happening? Because you can notice there's a lot of and sometimes not pretty things are happening.
And I think it's particularly true with predators. I find that it's could potentially be less of an issue with ungulates, in that they just behave a little differently. Their instinct is to flee, not to sort of engage, even though predators like to flee as well. But it's just that whole kind of dynamic is interesting, that predators tend to have the ability, I think, to both be very aggressive in ways. I mean, I guess ungulates can be too, but I feel like that there's a difference between the predator side and the ungulate and the prey side. So I guess that's for another discussion. But mostly, I'm more careful about the age of the beast, the animal, the subject, whether it's birds or whether it's big game animals or whether it's predators, the age of them, and sort of the condition or the place where we find them. Those are critical parts to personally making decisions that I feel like is, do something for it.
These are great points, Tony. However, so far we sort of put off people from photography. You have a big impact on the wildlife. Wildlife gets habituated, disturbance, and so on. People should look at a photo and see how not pretty they are. Stop photographing, stop taking people. I don't want folks to come out of this with the view like wildlife photography bad. Are there cases where, and what are those cases where wildlife photography is good, where it can support conservation, where it can tell the story? Surely there are the positive, there's a positive side of it as well.
Well, there is a positive side. I think the lines are blurry sometimes. I feel like part of the reason I've come to where I'm at with this whole issue is that there are just having experienced so many times such a volume of information, these volume of photographs. So on one hand, I look at it and go, there's plenty of that. Like we don't need a million more grizzly bear elk photos. Okay. We've got a lot now. So that's my personal thing. But on another hand, I think where there are opportunities are to expose species and show species doing things, or from a scientific perspective, even. There are plenty of people who would, without technology, would never believe that a wolverine could travel 2,000 miles. There are people who won't believe, for example, that a moose, in America we call them moose. From, say, you're used to seeing moose in a swamp to now there's moose out on the prairie where there's no water for 20 miles. Like a photograph, and I can say the same about grizzly bears. Here's a connection back to grizzly bears where I said before, okay, I'm not pursuing grizzly bears anymore as a sort of a gift to them so that I'm not putting them in danger, especially where we would photograph them traditionally. Is that, to me, there's value in a story like prairie bears. There's value in being in showing the world that bears, grizzly bears in particular, can exist for their lives, their entire life cycle, living where there aren't trees, where there's no mountains. Like, I think people would have a hard time. Like, they can look at the history book and say, oh, well, somebody said, grizzly bears used to cover half of North America and all the way into Mexico and all the way up to the Yukon and all these places, and Europe's is the same way. And so I think there is value in having visual, real life images of, say, a grizzly bear living out on a completely flat prairie ground with just grass. And to me, that story is important. Do we need 1,000 of them? This is the problem. Here's a question for you. Do we need a photograph of Bigfoot? Where would that end or begin? Like, that's always my question, is like, if you want to become known as a photographer, do the work or photograph Bigfoot. Seriously, everybody on the planet would know you if you had some real photographs of Bigfoot. And yet it would change the behavior of Bigfoot. It would, there's all kinds of ramifications for this. Would I photograph Bigfoot? Of course I would. Like, if I saw him, I'd be like, holy crap, it's Bigfoot. And I'd probably sell a photo or two. But how many photos? Where do we end? Where do we stop? And where are we more careful? If I had a photograph of, a grizzly bear with 4 cubs, and they were living out on the prairie in Missouri in the United States, which for people that don't know, that's sort of like, kind of central in the US. It's trees and some little bit of prairie here and there. But anyway, um, if I published it and we wrote a story about it, I mean, are we going to have 500 people running over there to try to photograph this poor bear and they run across the road and die? So this is a challenge. So I believe there is purpose, there's a need, and there's, for visual. I'm not the gatekeeper. Okay. Let's be clear about that. I'm not the gatekeeper on this. I'm just making moral decisions. I'm making value-based decisions myself based on what's important to me. And so to the extent my philosophy can help people just make better choices or at least think it through, I think that's important. But I'm certainly can't be the guy that says, well, we need to embargo all photos of grizzly bears on the prairie because we don't want to incite this sort of grizzly bear prairie photobomb of naturalists who are going to descend upon this one grizzly bear living on the prairie and sort of blow up its world.
This is very important conversation, I think, because I guess it goes down to the motivations, right? Why are you doing this? And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but a lot of that goes to the social media as well. How important would it be for someone to take any particular photo they want to take if only a handful of people would see it, like their spouse, their mother, their children, right, and his 2 best buddies. That's it. Would you still go buy a plane ticket, fly over to photograph the bear on the prairie? Probably, I would say that the number of people who would do that will be at least cut in half, or 80% of them wouldn't do it. So I guess I think I understand now your take on the value based. It's like, okay, what I value most and why am I doing this? Is it for, is it for likes? Is it for heartbeats on social media? Or is it something that I want to witness, right? And I guess it goes also to hunting, like where you go on a hunt and I sometimes come back and I get a phone call saying, oh, how was your hunt? It was great. Did you get one? No, I've seen a top of the ear of a deer. Great, but it was a great hunt. It was a great hunt because, I've been out there. I walked a lot. I've been in the fresh air, and I know where they are. Oh, I didn't know they're there. I saw the tip. It was clearly tip of the ear of a deer. I learned something as well. Where they are, where they move, like some great hunt, right? But it is for me. If you look at it from the perspective of an Instagram, oh god damn it, I lost the time. Pretty bad day. Haven't got my fix. So I think these are very important points, and what I'm taking is that this is not like we offering any ultimate solution or any ultimate answers. I think that people who listening and watching this, that at least should be starting of the thinking. Like next time you go to do something, you say, like, why are you doing this? Are you doing this for yourself? Are you doing this for claps? Are you doing this because of a social pressure?
I think it's really important in the sense that it reinforces what we kind of know about how to move forward as a society. If we look at the past, we recognize what's important about going forward. The more that we can interact with one another and be respectful of one another, I think that translates into more respect for everything. So the more we isolate, the more we decide that, we're going to draw lines and separate and we're going to extinguish your experience for our own. And we're going to say, you can do this and we can do that and you can't. And I mean, obviously within reason, I'm not suggesting it's okay to start wars. Don't look at it like that. I'm suggesting that the morals and the values-based approach to this is really, I think, part of the missing component when it comes to wildlife. I think we just move so rapidly. The technology's there. We're interested in the internet. I mean, there's all this stuff that changes now. And in the past, you had to have more of a connection to the land because that's the way we were. So there is this, I think, need and continued need that to bring young people. I mean, I have 3 daughters. They're all grown up and they have their lives. And 2 of them are nurses and one of them's getting a PhD in atmospheric science. And I never sat down with them at not one time and explained what they were going to do in their lives. I took them outside to places when they were very young and throughout their ages and let them explore that. So that, and this was my judgment at the time, and they're in their 20s, is say when they were 5, my vision for them was that they don't have to become environmentalists. And I'm not even going to push them towards that, or photographers, or they don't have to be any of that. They could become, well, my one, she has a degree in electrical engineering and she's, doing atmospheric science. So whatever, right? But the important thing is that every single one of them, when presented with the question or the information or the data about making decisions, is affected by that experience, those experiences. They don't have to be advocates for a clean, healthy river in the Missouri River breaks of Montana, but they know what it's about. And when they see something about that, they automatically know, wait a minute, we need to be careful about making really poor choices about the water quality in the Missouri River breaks of Montana, because that's our place. Even though we don't go there anymore, even though I'm not a radical environmentalist, even though I'm not a wildlife photographer, but have they never been exposed to that? It would just be a barren BLM land. We call it Bureau of Land Management land. It would just be like, it's just dry out there and there's just sagebrush and like nobody ever sees anything and it's hot. And when you go down there, it's like you get stuck in the mud and like they just have whatever stories they've seen and they listen to this sort of drumbeat of get rid of public lands and all this weird stuff happening today. But they have their own experience. So I think it's important to have these experiences that you don't need to turn someone into a radical like me. You just need to expose them. And then if they're nurtured well, they just make good choices for each other. And I mean, that's what I believe. I might be wrong. I do not believe you can beat people into submission. I don't believe you can just get out there and say, climate change is real. I'm going to beat the hell out of you until we fix it. It just doesn't work like that. People do not change their minds readily that way. In fact, they sometimes resist that kind of change. And in fact, it's never more evident to me that in the UK, where you have, the resistance to restoration of environments there is very polarizing. And it is here in the US too, but not like over there. I mean, it's become such a polarizing discussion that there's no way to even enter into it without everybody first asking, like, do you hunt? And then once you say yes or no, it's like discussion over. I know where you're coming from. And that's terrible. We can't do that. So anyway, that's my contribution. It's very lengthy and winded, but I think it's part of this sort of the solution to this stuff is being able to participate. And I'm not talking about like, oh, now you have to quit your job and become someone who teaches people the safety of hunting. It's not that radical, dude.
Like funny you mentioned the polarization of a conversation about restoring the environment. Same in Ireland. This is like, and it is very hard because another thing, just want to mention before we wrap this up, that people are often getting these labels, and at some point this is like very unhelpful, and it is very easy to be exploited. Or you're a hunter, or there are different types of hunters, or you're a farmer, right? And then like if you're a farmer, so this is what I really is hard for me. That is almost sort of like if you're a farmer, you're destroying the environment, you're this and that, and you're just harvesting subsidies, and you're just like, was like, hang on a minute, there's like a ton of farmers who are like as environmentally minded and as much conservationists as any of the, like the folks who are paying, like you said, they're just gonna pay money to environmental NGO. They couldn't come close because often like a pay my $5.99 a month is the easiest way, and it's just frankly lazy way. But then this is easy to be exploited by, it's like, oh, you're a farmer, oh, and then there's like everything in between. Then there are farmers who would like to do something, but economically they're already part of a system. We started it with being in a system. You can be in a good system or in a bad system, but that doesn't change where you are. You need to navigate that. So I guess it all depends on where anyone is in this spectrum. Tony, you were throwing a absolute gems from the start to the finish of this thing, but I need to ask you about like some final words of wisdom for listeners, for viewers who are listening to our conversation about the values, about basically this conversation that is going on, and is also societal, I guess, because we talked about policy, we talked about social conflict, we talked about social media. Any words of wisdom?
I think it's cliche to say that it's all connected, but I think that's part of this story, is that so our decisions have effect on other things. And so whether it be making decision to manage land a certain way consciously because it's your life, it's the way you make a living. It's sort of farming, or it's, I'm a hunter or a fisherman, or I'm a farmer, or like, that there are consequences to these decisions that we make. And if people would, generally speaking, just be patient enough to listen maybe a little more and learn a little bit more about the surroundings before we make changes. And this is why I brought up earlier the pace of change today. It is so rapid that it's hard for people to even begin to understand where we're at now, because it's changing so fast. And so when you're pressured by marketing and media and money, then the story between the sort of beginning and end is less important. It's like, okay, I have to make a living. I have to do this. I need to compete with that. We need more wheat. We need less of that. Like, this sort of world we're in is rapidly changing. And yet people don't have less need to understand their neighbor. They have just as much, but it's happening too fast. So if I had anything, it's like, just be careful about decision making. The United States briefly created a wonderful policy a number of years ago in the 70s called the National Environmental Policy Act. And the theory is important, which is, think about the things around you before you make a choice. Because among the choices you can make is to do nothing. And that sometimes is a better choice.
Words of wisdom right there, Tony. Listen, thank you so much. It's been absolute pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.
Before you go, since you stick to the end of this show, then first and foremost, thank you so much for listening and for watching. And if you enjoy what I do here, and I presume you do since you listen to the very end, you should subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description of the show, newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com. So get in there and you will get notifications not only about the latest episodes of the podcast, but also about everything else that is happening in the conservation and science world.